They said I was overreacting, but how would you feel if your sister's wedding was planned paid for and posted online before you even knew it existed? I wasn't on the guest list, not in print, not in pencil, not even as an afterthought. My mom said, "Clara, don't make this about you. It's just a wedding." But it wasn't. It was the moment I realized they hadn't forgotten the invitation. They'd forgotten me. I'm Clara Hayes, and this is how my sister's perfect wedding fell apart. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was one of those late San Diego evenings when the sky still held a trace of gold, and my apartment smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink. I was staring at the Pulse media deck on my laptop, rewriting a tagline for a wedding client for the third time. Notes were taped all over my monitor, phrases like emotional resonance and luxury through simplicity. My brain was running on autopilot, half in work mode, half somewhere else entirely. Then my phone rang. The screen lit up with one word that always made my stomach tighten. Mom. For a moment I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but something, habit, guilt, curiosity, made me pick up. "Hi, Mom," I said. Her voice came smooth, polite, and coded in that soft authority she'd perfected over decades of teaching elementary school. "Clara, sweetheart. I just wanted to remind you not to make a big deal out of things. It's just a wedding." I blinked. "A wedding? Yes, Emily's. I thought you knew already." The sentence landed slowly, like a dropped glass that takes too long to shatter. My throat went dry. Emily's getting married. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of her breathing through a faint hum of background noise. "Yes, she didn't tell you?" "Well, I'm sure she meant to. It's been hectic. Anyway, I don't want you to feel left out or anything. We just didn't want drama." I sat frozen, staring at the sticky note on my laptop that said, "Celebrate every love story, Mom." I managed. "When is it? Next month? In Maui. It's going to be beautiful. I'll send you pictures." "Okay." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. She filled the silence with her usual gentle command. "Don't overreact, Clara. It's really not that big of a deal." The line clicked dead. For a few seconds I stayed perfectly still, the hum of my computer fan filling the apartment. Then I reached for my phone again, opened Facebook, and there it was. A notification from Aunt Linda, tagged photos, smiling emojis, hearts, confetti. I tapped it. Emily stood in a bridal boutique in a white lace gown, sunlight spilling across her face. Mom held her hand, both of them glowing like a Hallmark postcard. The caption read, "Our girl is glowing." "Can't wait for Maui." I scrolled down. Hundreds of comments. "She's radiant. Such a beautiful family. Your daughters are everything." Elaine names I hadn't seen in years. Old teachers, neighbors, cousins, everyone congratulating them. Everyone knew. Everyone except me. My hand started shaking. I dropped the phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that echoed louder than it should have. My heartbeat filled my ears. I pressed the heel of my hand against my chest, trying to steady it, but it only made the silence feel heavier. I picked up the phone again, stared at the photo. Emily looked exactly like she did at 12 when she used to stand behind me at the mirror, imitating my smile, my pose, my clothes. I used to joke that she was my little reflection. Somewhere along the way, that reflection stopped belonging to me. The comments kept coming. Mom replying, with hearts. Emily thanking people, Dad leaving a single thumbs up. I stared at his name. No message. No call. No "wish you were here." It wasn't the first time they'd forgotten me. Just the most public. I walked to the window. Outside, the city stretched wide and glittering indifferent. Cars hissed along the freeway below their headlights, blinking like Morse code I couldn't decipher. Somewhere, music drifted from a rooftop bar, laughter echoing faintly. It felt like a world I didn't belong to, even though it was my own. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and whispered. They didn't even think to tell me. The air felt tight like the moment before a storm. I could almost hear my mother's voice again, gentle, reasonable, suffocating. "Don't make it about you. Don't overreact. It's just a wedding." I wanted to believe her. I wanted it to be just a wedding. Just another oversight, another accidental exclusion. But deep down, I knew better. This was intentional. This was the quiet kind of erasure that happens one small omission at a time until one day you realize you've been edited out entirely. I sat down at my desk, closed the laptop, and stared at the framed photo beside it. Emily and I, ages 6 and 11, standing barefoot in our grandmother's backyard, hands clasped, faces smeared with melted popsicle. We were both laughing, unfiltered, inseparable. In the picture, her hand was gripping mine tightly. In my memory, I could still feel that small, sticky warmth. Now the hand in the photo felt like a ghost. I set the frame down, turned off the lights, and let the city's glow wash over the room. The only sound left was the hum of the refrigerator and the whisper in my chest that said what I couldn't say out loud. They hadn't forgotten to invite me. They had simply forgotten that I was still part of them. Charleston, South Carolina, 2006. The air in our house always smelled like something cooking. Garlic onions, and whatever Mom had pulled together for dinner after work. The walls were a faded yellow, the kind of color that looked warm no matter the weather, and the old ceiling fan clicked with every slow turn. I was 16, standing in front of the dining table, clutching the note cards for my scholarship speech. "Okay," I said softly. "So this is for the regional contest next week. They said we can have feedback from family." Dad barely looked up from the newspaper. "Go ahead, honey." Before I could start, Emily coughed from the couch. She was 11, wrapped in a blanket, cheeks flushed pink. Mom went to her, immediately pressing a cool hand to her forehead. "She's burning up again." "Clara, sweetheart, keep your voice down. She needs rest." "I'll be quiet," I said. But Mom wasn't listening anymore. I stood there with the cards in my hand, the words I'd practiced for hours, suddenly meaningless. Dad turned the page of his paper. The ceiling fan clicked again. "Maybe later," I said quietly, folding the cards back into my notebook. Mom didn't answer. She was murmuring to Emily, telling her how brave she was, how strong she was, for trying to eat a little soup. I watched the back of her head, the way her hand smoothed Emily's hair. There was a small, dull ache in my chest that I couldn't name back then. At dinner, Emily sat at the table with a blanket around her shoulders. Mom spoon-fed her, smiling, like she was feeding royalty. Dad told a story about a project at work. I passed the salt when asked. No one asked about my contest. After we ate, Mom called Aunt Linda, her voice full of warmth. "Oh, you should have seen Emily today. She sang a little song from school. It was adorable." She laughed that same soft, glowing laugh she used whenever she talked about my sister. I waited for her to mention my name, but she didn't. That night I sat at my desk with the scholarship speech open in front of me. My handwriting looked uncertain. I thought maybe I should rewrite it, make it more exciting, more emotional. Something worth being proud of. But the truth was simple. No matter what I wrote, no one at that table would ever hear it. When I finally lay down, I promised myself I'd stop expecting applause. Years later, that promise still haunted me. I woke up sweating, heart racing, the images of that same dinner flashing through my mind. I was 34 now, miles away from Charleston, but the dream felt fresh. Mom at the stove, Dad behind the paper, Emily, under a blanket, all of them facing anywhere but me. The glow from the streetlights slipped through the blinds of my San Diego apartment. I got up, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window. Across the street, a family sat at their dining table, laughter spilling out through open windows. A little girl jumped up to show her father something on her tablet, and he clapped. I smiled despite myself, then felt that familiar heaviness return. I took a sip of water, stared out at the quiet neighborhood, and whispered into the dark. You don't grow out of being invisible. You just learn to move quietly. My phone buzzed on the counter. An email notification from Pulse Media. I set down the glass and opened it, scanning through the internal event calendar. My breath caught when I saw it. Client sponsorship. Emily Wright wedding Maui. For a moment, everything in me went still. My sister's name glowed on the screen attached to my company's logo. It wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was business. I sank into the couch, staring at the list of staff assigned to the project. It was one of those sleek luxury weddings that Pulse specialized in. Exclusive vendors' press coverage, carefully curated hashtags. I scrolled until I reached the staff contact section. My name wasn't there. The irony hit me hard. My company was promoting my sister's wedding, and once again I was nowhere on the guest list. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. The glow from the screen painted my living room in cold light. I could almost hear Mom's voice echo in my head. Clara, you're too sensitive. You always make everything about you, but it wasn't about me. Not really. It was about the quiet pattern that had been repeating for years, missed recitals, forgotten birthdays, polite texts instead of visits, and now a wedding everyone knew about, except the one person who was supposed to be family. I walked over to my bookshelf, pulled out a box of old photos, and flipped through them. There was one from my college graduation. Me in my cap and gown, standing alone. Mom and Dad had promised to come, but couldn't make it last minute. They'd sent an email instead. "We're proud of you, sweetheart. Sorry we couldn't make it." I remembered reading it in my dorm room, half smiling, half crying. I ran my finger along the edge of the photo. My smile looked real enough to fool anyone. Maybe it had even fooled me back then. Outside, a car alarm went off somewhere down the block. I closed the window, turned off the lights, and crawled back into bed. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling the same question: what would happen if I stopped pretending I was okay with being forgotten? The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. I stared at the ceiling until the first hints of dawn slipped into the room. By the time my alarm rang, I had already made a decision. Tomorrow I'd go to work, sit in the same meeting, smile at the same people. But this time, I'd pay attention. I'd stop letting things slide, stop brushing off the feeling that I didn't matter. And if the world decided to erase me again, I'd find a way to write myself back in. By the next morning, I had almost convinced myself to tuck it all away. The wedding, the photo, the silence. Pretend it didn't sting. Pretend I was fine. That was what I did best. The elevator hummed as it climbed to the 10th floor of Pulse Media. I could already smell the sterile mix of burnt espresso and lemon sanitizer, that faint scent of people who lived their lives under deadlines. The office was a sea of glass and muted tones, the kind of place where emotions looked out of place. I took a deep breath before stepping into the conference room. Derek Miller was already there, pacing near the window. He was in his early 40s, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from being the loudest man in any room. He looked up, offering his usual half-smile. "Clara," he said, voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "I know I can always count on you. You're calm, professional, reliable. You never let feelings interfere with the job." It wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis. "Thank you," I said quietly, though the words caught in my throat. "I understand the importance of staying objective." "Good." He tapped the table with his knuckle. "The upcoming wedding series is going to be our biggest yet. Clients want something aspirational, but subtle. You'll lead the messaging. Keep it elegant. You know, tasteful emotions. Tasteful emotions." The phrase almost made me laugh. I nodded instead. When the meeting ended, I lingered behind, straightening the stack of mock-ups I didn't care about. Derek's words replayed in my mind, how easily he mistook control for strength. Maybe everyone did. Back at my desk, the glow of the monitor reflected off the coffee cup beside me. My inbox overflowed with reminders about the Maui launch itineraries, press invites, shot lists for social campaigns. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I couldn't focus. "Hey," a voice said behind me. I turned to see Maya leaning on the partition, holding 2 coffees. Her curly hair was pulled into a loose bun, her expression soft but cautious. The look of someone who knows a secret, but isn't sure if she should say it aloud. "I brought you caffeine," she said. "I figured you'd need it." I smiled faintly. "You always know." She hesitated, setting the cup on my desk. "So, I saw your sister's engagement pictures online. You must be thrilled, right?" The pause that followed was too long to pass as normal. Maya's face fell. "Oh, shit. You didn't know." I shook my head, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "I know now." She sat down in the empty chair across from me. "God." "Clara, I'm sorry. Wow. Are you okay?" "I'm used to it," he said. "That's sort of the family motto." She frowned. "What do you mean they forget me sometimes?" I said simply, "It's tradition." Maya didn't press. She just sat there, tracing a finger along the rim of her coffee lid. "You know," she said finally. "Pulse is sponsoring a wedding in Maui next month. One of those luxury beach things. You're probably involved, right?" "I think so." I said, though my chest had already gone tight. Her phone buzzed and she glanced at the screen. "Wait. Emily Wright. That's your sister's name, isn't it?" My stomach dropped. I reached for my own phone, pulled up the internal memo I'd skimmed that morning. There it was again. "Emily Wright wedding, Maui, Hawaii. Sponsored by Pulse Media. Maya's eyes widened. Clara. Yeah. My voice was almost a whisper. That's her. For a second, we both sat in silence. The air between us thickened heavy with unspoken things. She exhaled slowly. So, what are you going to do? I didn't have an answer. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. My company, the place where I spent 12-hour days crafting fairy tale narratives for strangers, was about to market my own family's fairy tale one I'd been cut out of. I'll do my job, I said finally. That's what they pay me for. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and polite small talk. Every time someone mentioned Maui, my pulse quickened. Derek stopped by my desk once to drop a printout. You're on the travel list, he said casually. You'll be part of the on-site content team. Consider it a compliment. I stared at the document in my hand, my name bold and black right under the client's. When he walked away, I whispered, a compliment or a cosmic joke? By evening, the office had emptied out. I stayed behind pretending to finish edits. Outside, the city shimmered in the fading light, the skyline mirrored in the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened the wedding file again, scrolling through the creative brief, words like family, legacy, celebration of connection. I could almost hear Derek reading them out loud, oblivious to how hollow they sounded. Family, legacy, connection. The words hit differently when you didn't have them. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. Tired eyes, coffee-stained blouse hair that hadn't been brushed since morning. Behind my image, the Pulse Media logo glowed faintly on the opposite wall, its slick silver letters catching the light. For a moment, it looked like the two of us overlapped me, and the brand, the woman who sold stories she didn't believe in. Maybe that's what I was now. A reflection polished enough for display, empty enough not to offend anyone. I closed the laptop and sat still, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner. Somewhere in that mechanical rhythm, a strange clarity settled in. Fate didn't send invitations. It sent tickets, and apparently mine had already been booked. I picked up the printout with my name on it and folded it neatly into my notebook. The paper left a faint crease sharp against my fingers. As I switched off the office lights, the window caught my reflection one last time. Half woman, half shadow, both pretending to belong. Outside, the city buzzed softly, unaware that somewhere in a glossy office tower, one woman was beginning to realize that being invisible wasn't the same as being safe. The sky had already gone dark when I parked outside my apartment building. The hum of traffic on Harbor Drive filled the night, a steady pulse of headlights and noise. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the screen of my phone. My mother's name sat at the top of my contacts list, like a dare. I pressed call. The dial tone rang once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. No voicemail, no text, just silence. I tried again. Same thing. Finally, I typed a message. Mom, I just wanted to congratulate Emily. That's all. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Her reply was short-clipped. Don't make a big deal out of this. Emily's tired. Let her focus. I stared at the words until they blurred. The urge to throw my phone out the window came and went. Instead, I just set it down on the passenger seat and leaned back. After a while, I opened a new message thread and typed, Dad, can I ask what day Emily's wedding is? A few minutes later, focus on work, sweetheart. You've always been good at that. My jaw tightened. I could almost hear his voice, calm and distant, the kind of tone that could smooth over anything, including disappointment. My family had a way of silencing people without ever raising their voices. I sat there until the dashboard clock blinked past midnight, the city lights reflecting off the windshield, like tiny reminders that life went on for everyone else. Then I finally turned off the engine, climbed upstairs, and fell asleep on the couch, with my clothes still on. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating again. This time, it was Maya. You're not at the office, she said when I answered. Meet me at the cafe on 9th. Now. 20 minutes later, I walked into our usual spot, a narrow coffee shop tucked between a bookstore and a yoga studio. The smell of roasted beans hit me like something familiar and grounding. Maya was already there, hair pulled into a loose bun laptop, open 2 coffees waiting. She looked up when I sat down. Okay, she said, spreading a stack of papers across the table. Here's the deal. I got the internal itinerary for Maui. Guess who's overseeing digital branding? I blinked. You, she smirked. You, I sighed. Of course. Maya turned the screen toward me, showing a map of the resort. We're both on the team. Flights next week. It's a big one, Clara. Press coverage, influencer deals, full content cycle. It's going to be a circus. I stared at the resort's name on the screen. Pacific Pearl. The same one in Aunt Linda's Facebook tag. I could almost see it already, the white sand, the floral arches, my mother's smile. Maya watched me carefully. I know what you're thinking, she said. But look at it this way. It's just work. A trip. You don't even have to see them. I don't know, I said quietly. It feels like walking into a mirror I never asked to look at. She reached into her bag, pulling out something wrapped in soft tissue paper. Then walk into it, looking like the version of yourself they never expected to see. I raised an eyebrow. What is that A gift, she said. Technically a loan, but if it fits, it's yours. Inside the paper was a dress. A soft silk, the color of late sunlight, not gold exactly, but something warmer. The kind of dress that didn't need attention but still caught it. Maya smiled. When they say you're too emotional, too sensitive, too much, wear this. Show them that sensitivity isn't weakness. It's proof you still feel something they can't. I traced the fabric with my fingers. It's beautiful. So are you, she said simply. You just forget. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The clatter of cups and low hum of conversation filled the space around us. I thought about the last time my mother had complimented me. Maybe my high school graduation. No, she'd said. You look tired. You should smile more. I looked back at Maya. What if I actually run into them? Then stand still, she said. Don't say anything. Just exist. Let them see what they chose to erase. Her words hit deeper than I expected. We finished our coffee in silence, both pretending to scroll through emails, while the air between us thickened with everything we didn't say. When it was time to leave, Maya gathered her things and squeezed my shoulder before walking out. I stayed behind for a minute, staring at the dress folded neatly in its paper. That evening, back in my apartment, I hung it on the back of the closet door. The fading sun poured through the blinds, washing the walls in gold. I turned off the overhead light and stood in front of the mirror, letting the glow of dusk settle around me. The silk caught the light shimmering softly. I ran a hand over the fabric and whispered to my reflection. They called it overreacting. The woman in the mirror looked back at me, steady, unflinching. Maybe this time, I said. I'll let them see what they created. The room went quiet, except for the hum of the city outside, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something unfamiliar. Control. I left the dress hanging by the mirror, its reflections spilling a warm golden glow across the wall. It looked almost like sunlight, fragile and fierce at the same time. And as I turned off the lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, I thought maybe this was the first thing in years that didn't make me feel invisible. The plane dropped through a bank of clouds, and for a moment the sky was nothing but light and motion. Then the island appeared. Green cliffs, ribbons of surf curling against the sand, the endless blue that always looked unreal in photographs. When the tires touched the runway, I felt the jolt all the way through my chest. Maui air hit differently, thicker, saltier, alive. As I stepped out of the terminal, wind tugged at my hair, carrying a faint scent of flowers and sea. The driver holding the Pulse Media placard smiled, his skin browned by the sun. Aloha, Ms. Hayes. Welcome. The resort for our company event sat along the quieter north shore, where the waves sounded closer and the world moved slower. From the balcony of my room, I could see the horizon stretch until it melted into haze. Somewhere farther south, I could almost hear the distant hum of music. The start of Emily's wedding weekend. The sound carried faintly on the wind, just enough to remind me that I was near but still unseen. I unpacked methodically, like I always did, laptop, charger, toiletries, notebook. The golden dress hung from the closet door, glowing softly in the afternoon light. By the time the orientation meeting ended, the sun had started to dip. I wandered toward the outdoor bar near the pool, drawn by the sound of a guitar and low laughter. That's where I saw him. Nolan Brooks, I said before my brain caught up with my mouth. He turned, and for a second the years folded in on themselves. He looked almost the same, broad shoulders, tanned skin, camera strap across his chest, a quiet steadiness in his eyes. Clara Hayes, he said, smiling. I knew that was you. You always did have that, I'm thinking about 5 things at once look. I laughed, surprised at how easy it was. You're still good at reading people. Occupational hazard. He lifted his camera. I'm here filming a doc for PBS. Working title Silent Women. I raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. It's about people like me who don't know when to stop overthinking. Not exactly, he said, his tone softening. It's about women who've learned that silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's just survival. His words hung between us for a moment, tangled in the breeze. We took our drinks, his neat whiskey, my white wine, and walked down toward the beach. The sand was warm, fine as sugar. The horizon glowed orange, fading into lavender. So he said after a while, "You're with Pulse now." Yeah, communications, mostly crisis management, which is funny considering my personal life is kind of a crisis right now. Tell me, he said. I hesitated, then told him about the photo. The call, the silence that came after. He didn't interrupt, didn't pity me, just listened. When I finished, he kicked at the sand with his barefoot eyes on the waves. You know, he said, there's this thing about people like you. You spend your whole life thinking if you're successful enough, kind enough, composed enough, they'll finally see you. But sometimes the more you build, the more they need you to stay small. Because if you shine too bright, they can't ignore what they've done. I exhaled slowly. That's poetic for a guy who used to skip philosophy class. He grinned. I got better at listening. The tide crawled up to our feet, cool and soft. For a moment we stood there like two people pretending not to share the same wound. I used to think I said quietly that my success would fix things, that if I gave them something to be proud of, they'd stop pretending I didn't exist. But I think I made it easier for them. I became the proof that they didn't have to care. He looked at me, eyes catching the fading light. Then maybe it's time you exist again, not to be seen by them, but for yourself. The words hit somewhere deep, a clean ache I didn't expect. I turned toward the horizon where the sun hovered low and molten. I don't know if I know how to do that, I said. You'll figure it out, he said. You already started. When he left to meet his crew, I stayed on the beach until the sky bruised into purple. Then I went back to my room, washed off the sand, and opened the closet. The golden dress shimmered under the soft light, more like dusk than gold. I slipped it on the fabric smooth against my skin, weightless, but grounding. Out on the balcony, the wind tugged at the hem, carrying the faint sound of a wedding band rehearsing somewhere down the coast. The sun flared once more before sinking a blaze that turned everything it touched to fire. For the first time in months, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel erased. I raised my phone and looked into the camera, not to pose, but to witness. My voice came out calm, almost steady. If they ever said I was too sensitive, I said softly, then this is my real reaction. I hit record. The screen glowed faintly in the dimming light, capturing the outline of a woman standing on a balcony wrapped in gold, the ocean behind her, the wind threading through her hair. I didn't smile. I didn't perform. I just looked straight into the lens, let the silence breathe, and pressed save. The last light of day broke across the horizon, scattering into 1,000 shards of gold, and for a heartbeat, I could almost believe I was free. The ocean was a constant whisper outside my window that night. The wind rattled the glass. The air smelled faintly of salt and rain, and the only light in the room came from the small desk lamp beside my camera. Its glow stretched across the floor in a narrow line, cutting through the darkness like something deliberate. I sat down in front of the lens, my fingers trembling just enough to make the camera shake. I steadied it, then steadied myself. The red recording light blinked to life. I looked at my reflection on the screen. Hair still damp from the shower, eyes rimmed with fatigue skin, pale in the warm light. There was no makeup, no script, just me and the silence. My whole life, I began. I was told to calm down. The words came out softer than I expected. I paused, letting them settle. I grew up in a house where emotions came with labels, dramatic, overreacting too much. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I questioned anything, I was disrespectful. If I went quiet, I was cold. Eventually, I learned the safest thing was to say nothing at all. I stopped, exhaled slowly, and watched my own breath cloud the lens for a second before fading. I used to believe they were right. That silence made me strong. But now I think maybe silence is just another way they made me disappear. The wind outside grew louder, brushing against the balcony, like an audience that didn't want to interrupt. I took another breath, straightened my shoulders, and looked directly into the lens. They called it overreacting. A small, steady smile touched the corner of my mouth. I call it reacting honestly. For a few seconds, I just sat there. The camera caught the flicker of the lamp, the sound of the waves hitting shore, the quiet proof that I was still here. Then I reached forward and pressed stop. A message from Maya popped up almost immediately. Maya uploaded, "Don't overthink this. Me." "You really think I should, Maya?" "It's already real. Might as well let the world see it." I looked back toward the ocean. The tide was high now, foamy crests glowing white under the moonlight. Somewhere down the coast, faint music drifted from the resort, hosting Emily's rehearsal dinner. I could almost picture the champagne glasses clinking the laughter. Without thinking twice, I clicked upload. The file bar inched forward, the blue light crawling across the screen like time itself slowing down. When it hit 100%, the sound of the waves filled the silence. I closed the laptop and let the wind carry the moment away. By morning, sunlight was pouring through the curtains. I hadn't meant to fall asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the clock read 8:04. A knock sounded on the door. It was Nolan, holding 2 coffees and grinning like someone with news. "Morning, troublemaker." I blinked. "What?" He handed me the coffee and waved his phone. "Your video. You might want to check this out." I took the phone from him. On the screen, the thumbnail of my face filled the feed. The golden dress, the balcony, the caption I'd typed without thinking. "It's not just a wedding." Underneath, 120,000 views. Comments multiplying by the second. I sat down slowly, scrolling through the feed. The messages weren't cruel. They were raw, confessional, painfully honest. My sister did the same to me. My mother told me I was too emotional when I cried at her funeral. I thought I was the only one. Each one felt like a heartbeat I could hear. Nolan sat across from me, sipping his coffee. "You didn't just post a video, Clara. You started a conversation." I shook my head, still staring at the numbers rising. "I didn't mean to start anything. I just needed to say it." He smiled faintly. "That's usually when people listen." The phone buzzed again. Maya this time. "You're viral," her message read. "And before you panic, it's good viral." I couldn't decide whether to laugh or hide. By late morning, every platform had reposted it. Women stitched their own videos beside mine, sharing stories of being called dramatic, too much, too sensitive. The hashtag, "It's not just a wedding," spread like wildfire. I watched it unfold in real time, the same way you watch a wave build far out at sea, not knowing how big it'll be when it hits. For the first time in years, I felt both terrified and free. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, someone else was watching it too. Charleston, South Carolina. Emily stood in a bridal boutique, a crown of white flowers resting on her curls, veil draped over one arm. Mom sat nearby, flipping through her phone while the stylist adjusted the gown's hem. A friend of Emily's looked up from her screen. "Oh my God, you have to see this. Some woman posted this video. It's trending everywhere. Listen." She held the phone out. The clip began. "I grew up in a house where emotions came with labels. Dramatic, overreacting too much." Emily's face went still. She reached for the phone, her hands trembling. The camera zoomed in on a woman in a golden dress standing on a balcony, voice calm, eyes sharp with truth. The stylist looked up. "She kind of looks like you." Emily's skin drained of color. "Give me that," Mom said, quickly taking the phone. She stared at the title, "It's Not Just a Wedding." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned off the sound, pressed the phone against her chest, and whispered, "Turn off the music." The boutique went silent except for the faint rustle of fabric. Back in Maui, I sat on the balcony, coffee growing cold in my hand, the wind carrying the distant sound of the sea. I hadn't planned for any of this. I hadn't said their names. But maybe the truth didn't need names to find the people it belonged to. The ocean roared softly in the background, and I thought to myself, maybe some mirrors don't reflect faces. They reflect consequences. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I'd overreacted at all. Morning sunlight spilled across the room, too bright for how heavy the air felt. My laptop sat open on the desk, the Pulse Media logo glowing on the screen. Derek's face filled the video call. Sharp suit, sharp tone, the same practiced calm he used when pretending to care. "Clara," he began, voice-clipped, "we need to address this situation. Your video is gaining traction. It's making some of our clients nervous." I took a slow breath. "Derek, it's a personal story. I never mentioned the company." He leaned closer to the camera, eyebrows drawn. "In this business, there's no such thing as personal. You are Pulse Media whether you like it or not. That's the risk of visibility." "I'm not asking for visibility," I said. "I just wanted to tell the truth." He exhaled a short, frustrated sound. "Then tell it privately. We don't need another PR crisis. Take it down. No, I said quietly. His jaw tightened. Clara, you don't understand how this works. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. You just want silence that looks like professionalism. The pause on his end was thick enough to choke on. Finally, he said, in our world, there's no difference. Then the screen went black. The call ended with a hollow chime, leaving only the sound of waves outside my window. I closed the laptop and sat back staring at my reflection in the dark screen. My pulse was loud in my ears. For years I'd been paid to manage other people's narratives. Now mine had slipped out of control, and I couldn't decide if that terrified me or set me free. Later that morning I went down to the cafe near the resort pool. The smell of roasted coffee mixed with sunscreen and ocean air. My phone buzzed constantly. Notifications, comments, tagged reposts. The hashtag, "It's Not Just a Wedding," had hit the trending list overnight. Every time I refreshed the screen, more voices appeared, women in their 40s, 60s, college girls, strangers across the country. I was told I was overreacting when my husband cheated. My daughter stopped talking to me after I called her dramatic. Now I understand. She's right. It's never just about the wedding. I scrolled until the words blurred together. A mix of fear and something electric built in my chest. This wasn't just mine anymore. Nolan found me at the corner table, sunglasses pushed up in his hair. He carried a newspaper folded in half, and 2 iced coffees. You made page 3, he said, setting the cup in front of me. What? He slid the paper across the table. The headline read, "The Woman Who Said Enough," underneath a still from my video. Me, in the golden dress hair swept by wind, eyes steady. The article framed it like a movement, not a confession. My stomach turned. I didn't ask for this. I know, he said. That's why people believe you. For a while we sat in silence, both reading snippets of the article. When I finally looked up, Nolan was watching me carefully. You okay? I let out a small, disbelieving laugh. I don't know. I feel like I started a fire. I didn't mean to light. Maybe, he said, but some things need to burn before they can be rebuilt. Across the world, that fire was spreading faster than I could imagine. Charleston, South Carolina. In a bridal suite drenched in soft light, Emily sat in front of a mirror while a makeup artist dusted shimmer across her cheekbones. Her phone vibrated on the vanity, group chat notifications lighting up one after another. She finally glanced down. Messages flashed from friends, bridesmaids, vendors. Have you seen this? Is this your sister? Are you okay? Emily's hand trembled as she opened the video. The sound filled the room. They called it overreacting. I call it reacting honestly. The brush stopped midair. The makeup artist looked confused. Emily's face went pale. Turn that off, she said sharply. Her mother's reflection appeared behind her holding her own phone. What is it? Nothing. Emily said too quickly. Just someone online. Elaine pressed. Let me see. Emily hesitated, then handed her the phone. For a moment, her mother's expression stayed blank. Then the color drained from her face. Where did this come from? She whispered. I don't know, Emily said, panic rising in her voice. I didn't tell her anything. I swear I didn't. Elaine took her daughter's hands, squeezing too hard. Don't cry, she said, glancing toward the doorway, where a bridesmaid lingered. People are watching. The words sounded exactly the same as they did in my memories. Polite, desperate, cruel. Back in Maui, I watched as strangers online dissected my voice, my story, my family. Some called me brave, others accused me of being bitter. But most of them just said thank you. Their silence used to protect them. Now it protected no one. I refreshed the feed again. It's Not Just a Wedding was number 2 on Twitter. My phone buzzed nonstop. For every message of support, there was one of curiosity. Who was she talking about? Which family is this real? The truth was out there, nameless but recognizable to anyone who'd lived it. Nolan leaned back in his chair, watching me scroll. You look scared, he said. I am, I admitted. And free. Which feels like the same thing right now. He smiled faintly. Freedom usually starts that way. Just as I exhaled, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me swipe. Ms. Hayes. The voice on the other end was clipped authoritative. This is Charlotte Wright. I believe you know my future daughter-in-law, Emily. The name hit like cold water. Yes, I said slowly. I thought so, she replied. I've just read about your video. Quite a spectacle. I'm sure you didn't intend to involve my family, but unfortunately the internet has other ideas. I said nothing. She continued, tone steady but sharp. My company values discretion above all else. We can't be associated with a family scandal. Effective immediately, the reception is canceled. You may inform your sister. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat frozen, the phone pressed to my ear long after the call ended. Nolan leaned forward. What happened? I set the phone down, my fingers numb. She just pulled the plug. The wedding. The reception. Everything. His eyes widened. Because of you, I let out a shaky breath. Because of what they did. And what they tried to hide. Outside, the ocean wind picked up scattering napkins from the cafe tables. Somewhere in the distance, a storm was building, and for once, I didn't rush to stop it. The office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, real paper, not the digital kind that lived in inboxes. Morning light streamed through tall glass windows, landing across framed newspaper clippings about landmark free speech cases. The Honolulu air outside felt heavy and warm, but inside it was calm and deliberate. Across the table sat Harper Collins, her short dark hair tucked behind one ear. Eyes sharp but kind. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. They can threaten to sue, she said, tapping a pen against her legal pad. But they can't sue you for telling the truth. Not in this country. I nodded, though my hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said quietly. I just want them to stop pretending I don't exist. That, Harper said, leaning back in her chair, is enough to make people uncomfortable. Especially people who've benefited from your silence. She smiled, not mockingly, but like someone who'd seen this before. You'd be surprised how often freedom of speech and emotional honesty overlap. Her words settled in me like a small, steady flame. On the flight over from Maui, I'd spent hours reading the flood of articles and think pieces about my video. Some called it a feminist manifesto. Others called it a family tragedy. But to me, it was neither. It was a diary entry I hadn't meant for the world to see. Harper slid a document across the table. Your parents' legal representative sent this to my office yesterday. It's a cease and desist letter full of vague threats and moral outrage, mostly noise. I scanned the lines. The words blurred together. Defamation, damages, emotional distress. I'm guessing they didn't consult a real PR team, Harper added. It's sloppy. Empty threats from people who feel exposed. Exposed, I asked. She nodded. When someone builds their identity around being respectable, truth feels like humiliation. You didn't do anything wrong, Clara. You just shifted the spotlight. I stared at the letter fingers tightening around the edge of the paper. What happens if they actually try to go through with it? Then we remind them what discovery means. Harper said, and trust me, they won't like what that process uncovers. For the first time that week, I almost laughed. I left the office with a strange lightness in my chest, like I'd been carrying something heavy for years without realizing it. By the time I got back to my hotel, the storm had rolled in. Waves crashed against the shore, rain streaked across the balcony doors. I opened my laptop to a flood of internal company emails. Subject urgent, crisis meeting. The video call started 5 minutes later. Derek's face filled the screen again, but this time he wasn't alone. A handful of executives from Pulse Media sat around a conference table, eyes glossy under the fluorescent lights. Behind them, a projector displayed a slide titled, Crisis Management, Clara Hayes. Derek's tone was smooth rehearsed. We need to discuss damage control. Ms. Hayes' recent actions have caused reputational harm to our brand and disrupted our partnership with the Right account. He looked straight at me through the camera, his expression a mix of disappointment and control. Clara, this is your opportunity to clarify your intentions. I stared back. My intentions? Yes, he said. You can either cooperate, take the video down, issue an apology, or risk termination. The words didn't surprise me. The ease with which he said them did. Before I could respond, Maya's face appeared in the grid of tiny windows. That's not fair, Derek, she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. She didn't mention Pulse Media, and she didn't lie. We spend millions every year on campaigns about authenticity, and now we're punishing someone for being it. Derek shot her a warning look. Maya, that's enough. No, she said. If this company stands for anything, it should be honesty. Otherwise, we're no better than the families we write crisis statements for. Silence followed, sharp and uncomfortable. I could almost hear the click of the air conditioner in the background of their boardroom. I took a breath. If you're asking me to apologize for speaking the truth, I said I can't do that. Derek's jaw flexed. Then you leave me no choice. He nodded to someone off screen. A moment later, my inbox pinged with a new email. Notice of temporary suspension. I didn't bother reading it. I just closed my laptop. Outside, the storm had eased into a soft drizzle. I grabbed my bag, slipped on my sandals, and walked out into the warm, wet air. The rain hit my skin like punctuation. I didn't feel angry. I felt clean. Justice isn't a courtroom. Sometimes it's just someone refusing to stay quiet one more time. I walked along the beach until the rain turned to mist. By the time I reached the far edge of the resort, my phone buzzed with a new email. This one from Harper. Subject update. They've withdrawn the lawsuit. Below it, a short note. Also, FYI, Pulse Media is under investigation by a labor committee for employee coercion during crisis management cases. Seems karma moves faster than the legal system. I stopped walking. The sky was clearing streaks of pink breaking through the clouds. I didn't smile, not really. But the corners of my mouth lifted just enough to catch the light. Somewhere back in San Diego, they were probably drafting a new PR statement, another masterpiece of polished half-truths. But for once, it wasn't my job to make the lie sound believable. I looked out at the horizon where the sea met the sky and whispered to myself, "Let them handle their own silence for a change." The wind answered with a soft rush, carrying away everything that no longer belonged to me. Saturday morning in Charleston came heavy and airless, the kind of southern heat that made even the flowers wilt before noon. The church stood quiet at the end of a gravel road, its white paint gleaming under a sky that promised storms. Inside, the smell of lilies mixed with sweat and nerves. Emily sat in front of the mirror, her wedding dress spreading like spilled cream across the chair. Her makeup was perfect, but her eyes were swollen and red. The stylist hovered nearby, unsure whether to keep working or leave her alone. The door opened. Mom. Elaine stepped in, clutching her phone as if it were something fragile. Her voice was rough when she spoke. Charlotte Wright called. She's pulled all funding for the reception. The venue, the caterer, the press coverage, gone. She said she doesn't want her family's name in the same headline as this mess. Emily's reflection froze. What? Why? I didn't do anything wrong. Elaine sank into the chair opposite her. She said it's not personal, just business. But you know what that means. Tears filled Emily's eyes, her lipstick trembling along the edge of her mouth. She can't do that. We signed contracts. Behind them, Dad, Richard, leaned against the doorframe, his shirt collar open tie hanging loose around his neck. His voice came low, almost to himself. Maybe the mistake wasn't the wedding. Maybe it was everything we built on silence. Elaine turned toward him sharp. Don't start. He didn't answer, just shook his head and walked out. Emily pressed her hands to her face. What am I supposed to do now? Everyone's already here. Elaine moved to her, smoothing her hair the way she used to when Emily was a child. You'll walk down that aisle. We'll make it work. Even if there's no music, no photographer, you'll still look beautiful. But what about Thomas? He'll show up, Elaine said quickly. Too quickly. He'll understand. Outside, the air buzzed with cicadas. Inside, a fan creaked overhead, pushing warm air around the room. The flowers along the pews drooped under the heat. Guests whispered confused as they were told to take their seats. The string quartet had canceled that morning. So had the photographer. A few vendors arrived, looked around, and left. What was supposed to be the biggest day of Emily's life had shrunk to something small and echoing. When the ceremony began, the only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional cough from the pews. I wasn't there, but I could picture it. How silence must have filled that space like smoke. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the room. Back in Maui, the news alerts started pinging my phone before noon. I didn't click them. Not yet. In Charleston, the minister cleared his throat, trying to keep the moment intact. Do you Emily Hayes take this man? Her phone buzzed in her hand. A bridesmaid leaned forward to whisper, You might want to see this. Emily frowned, glancing down. On the screen, a friend had sent her a short clip. Mine. My face, the golden dress, the balcony. The words now stamped with a caption someone else had written. When you erase someone, they don't disappear. They rewrite themselves. The camera cut to the line of comments, the thousands of shares. Emily's lips parted. Her vision blurred. The minister stopped speaking. Emily, She blinked, tears spilling onto her cheeks. The sound of her own name seemed foreign. Mom reached forward. "Honey, look at me." Emily looked at her, then down at her phone again. "She didn't even say my name, Mom, but everyone knows." "Put the phone away," Elaine said, voice low, brittle. "You can still fix this." "No," Emily whispered. "I don't think I can." She stepped back, the hem of her dress dragging across the aisle runner, gathering dust. The room went still as she turned and walked away past the pews, out the open doors into the blinding light. Outside, the wind had picked up, tossing petals from the abandoned floral arch into the air. Her heels sank into the gravel. She didn't stop walking until she reached the edge of the churchyard, where the road curved toward the water. From inside, Elaine's voice echoed faintly, pleading, commanding, but Emily didn't turn back. By afternoon, the story had hit every corner of the internet. Someone had filmed her walking out, dress torn slightly at the seam, sunlight glaring behind her. The video, only 20 seconds long, spread across social media like a match dropped in dry grass. The caption read, "When my sister's wedding fell apart." 3 million views in less than a day. At first, people thought it was scripted, a metaphor, a campaign. Then they found the connection, the surname, the original video. By evening, the story had evolved into something else entirely. Articles appeared with titles like "The Family That Built Silence" and "It's Not Just a Wedding, It's a Reckoning." I read the headlines from my balcony as the sun went down over Maui, each one a surreal echo of something I hadn't meant to start. The breeze carried the faint sound of waves and distant laughter from another celebration somewhere down the coast. Someone else's perfect day. I set my phone face down and closed my eyes. I didn't need to see the fallout to know it had begun. The headlines arrived before the morning coffee did. Every paper, every site, every blog seemed to carry a version of the same story. The Hayes family. A portrait of silence. Shattered. I sat at my kitchen counter in San Diego, scrolling through the news on my laptop. Photos of my parents' house filled the screen, curtains drawn, reporters stationed on the sidewalk. Someone had taken a picture of my mother stepping outside in her robe to collect the mail, her face hidden behind a newspaper. The caption read, "Elaine Hayes declines to comment." I shut the computer. The sound of the lid closing felt louder than it should have. Across the country, my mother had stopped answering calls. The neighbors said she hadn't been seen since the wedding that never was. My father, on the other hand, had become an unwilling public figure. Someone caught him walking the neighborhood baseball cap pulled low when a reporter called out, "Mr. Hayes, are you proud of your daughters?" His reply was quoted everywhere the next day. Both of them are right in their own way. It wasn't much, but it was more than I'd ever expected him to say. Emily deleted all her social media accounts. The last thing she posted before going quiet was a single sentence. "Some stories tell themselves whether you want them to or not." The comment section filled with strangers debating who was to blame. I didn't read past the first 10. Back in Maui, Pulse Media was unraveling. The Wright family had canceled every remaining contract. Clients demanded distance. Derek had been called before the board, accused of negligence and coercion. By the time I returned to San Diego, an internal email made it official. Effective immediately. Derek Miller is suspended pending investigation. Maya sent me a photo from her office. A new nameplate on the door. Maya Sullivan, interim director. She'd added a single line under the picture. "Sometimes justice whispers." I smiled for the first time in days. When I finally stepped into my apartment again, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The half-burned candle on the counter. The stack of unread mail. The faint smell of lavender detergent. But something inside me had shifted. I filled the kettle, poured tea into the chipped mug I'd owned since college, and sat by the window. Outside, the city moved like it always did, indifferent, unstoppable. I opened my inbox, expecting the usual flood of PR updates. Instead, the subject line stopped me cold. "Thank you for your video. You said what I couldn't. My mother told me I was overreacting too. Hundreds of messages, each one a small, beating heart of recognition. Women from Ohio, Florida, Portland, even a teacher from Alaska. Some told me they'd shown the video to their daughters. Some said it made them call their sisters for the first time in years. I scrolled slowly, reading every line until the letters blurred. For so long, I had been afraid my silence had made me disappear. Now my voice. soft, accidental, was reaching places I'd never imagined. I didn't need to win. I just needed to know I didn't have to stay quiet anymore. A knock at the door pulled me back. I opened it to find Nolan standing there, the California sun behind him, a bakery box in his hands. "I come bearing peace offerings," he said. I stepped aside to let him in. "If that's pie, you're officially forgiven for disappearing all week." "It's cookies," he said, setting the box on the counter. "And I didn't disappear. I figured you needed space to breathe." I poured him tea. He leaned against the counter, studying me. "So," he said finally, "how does it feel to be the woman everyone's quoting this week?" "Unreal," I admitted. "A little terrifying, mostly quiet." He laughed softly. "Quiet, huh? That's rich coming from you." I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me," he grinned. "You do realize you've made half the internet talk about emotional honesty for 3 days straight? Then maybe I'm contagious." We sat by the window sharing cookies, the kind of comfortable silence that didn't feel heavy. After a while, Nolan looked at me, something warm in his eyes. "You think they still call you too sensitive?" I smiled, setting down my cup. "If they do, at least now they'll have to say it louder." He laughed, the sound filling the small space like sunlight. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Maya had sent another message, a photo of a glossy magazine cover, one of the national lifestyle issues that usually featured politicians or movie stars. On it was a picture I recognized instantly. Me, on the Maui balcony, hair caught in the wind, the ocean behind me. Across the top, in bold white letters, "Silence is strength." I stared at it for a long time, the edges of the photo reflecting against the window glass. There was no sense of triumph in me, no satisfaction in being right. Just an unexpected calm, like the sound of a door closing softly after years of being left ajar. Nolan looked over my shoulder. "That's a hell of a photo." I nodded. "It doesn't even look like me." "It does," he said. "It's just the version of you that finally stopped asking permission to exist." Outside, a faint breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the smell of ocean salt that somehow found its way inland. The kettle whistled again, quiet but steady. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the noise in my life was something to manage. It just felt like proof that I was still here. Spring sunlight in Los Angeles always felt different, softer, less like heat, and more like permission. The office of Voice Forward smelled faintly of new paint and coffee, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let the city in without the noise. My desk sat near the corner, covered in folders labeled Community Grant Survivor Advocacy and Media Equity Project. For the first time in my career, the paperwork in front of me didn't feel like a mask. It felt like momentum. The nonprofit had started as a small initiative by Cameron Shaw, a venture capitalist, who'd grown tired of funding stories about empowerment without ever seeing any. Now, it was a full-fledged organization, a place for women to learn how to speak, write, and lead without apology. I ran my hand across the bold letters printed on the day's agenda workshop 01. Overreacting. When you were taught to stay silent, 20 folding chairs filled the room. I stood at the front, the projector humming softly behind me. As the women began to arrive, the space filled with the sound of conversation, tentative at first, then slowly warmer. Some came in heels and blazers, others in jeans and sneakers. A few carried notebooks already half full. When the clock hit 10, I took a breath and smiled. "Welcome," I said. "I'm Clara Hayes, and this is not a therapy group. It's a beginning." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room. We were taught that strong women don't cry, that calm means control, that silence means grace. But maybe I paused, letting my eyes move across the faces in front of me. Maybe grace doesn't mean shrinking. Halfway through the session, I asked them to share moments when they were told they were overreacting. A woman in her 50s spoke first. "My daughter came out last year. I wanted to defend her when the family said hurtful things, but my mother told me, 'Don't make a scene.'" She swallowed hard. "I wish I'd known sooner that quiet doesn't always mean peace." Another woman, barely 20, said, "I reported harassment at work. My boss told me I was too emotional to be taken seriously." Her voice cracked. I nodded, steady and deliberate. "You're not too emotional," I said. "You're just someone who refuses to play along." Laughter and tears tangled in the air. The hour passed quickly, the kind of time that doesn't feel like passing, but unfolding. As the last woman stood to leave, she touched my shoulder lightly. "You said once that silence was survival," she said. "I think I finally understand that survival isn't the same as living." I smiled. Exactly. When the room emptied, I stood by the window for a while, watching the traffic on Wilshire Boulevard crawl by. The reflection in the glass caught me off guard. Older, calmer, but somehow more solid than before. That's when Nolan showed up. He leaned against the doorway holding a coffee and the latest issue of Modern Voices magazine. "I brought you something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Is it caffeine or chaos?" "Both." He handed me the magazine, grinning. The cover was simple. Muted gold tones, my face framed by sunlight hair swept by the wind. The caption read, "Grace reclaimed, the woman who made silence mean strength." For a second, I couldn't breathe. Nolan sat on the windowsill watching me. "You okay?" "I never thought I'd see my name next to that word," I said quietly. "Grace." He shrugged. "Maybe you didn't lose it. Maybe you just took it back." We went outside, sitting in the courtyard, where the air smelled of jasmine and rain-soaked pavement. The late afternoon light turned everything honey-colored. "I used to want everyone to see me," I said after a while. "Now I just want to be quiet without it meaning something's wrong." He smiled. "That sounds like freedom. Maybe it is." The wind rustled the trees, soft and rhythmic like breathing. I felt the phone buzz in my pocket, but didn't rush to check it. Nolan nudged me. "You going to see what that is?" I sighed and pulled it out. The sender's name flashed across the screen. HarperCollins. Subject: "You'll want to read this." I opened the message. "Pulse Media has reached out. They're requesting a partnership with Voice Forward, training for their communications team on ethical storytelling and responsible crisis management. They want you to lead it." For a moment, I just stared at the screen. Nolan caught the look on my face. "What is it?" I handed him the phone. "Karma," I said simply. He read it, then smiled, slow and wide. "Looks like it found its way home." I leaned back on the bench, sunlight catching on my hair, the noise of the city soft around us. For years I'd been told to lower my voice, to take up less space, to stop overreacting. Now the same people who once silenced me were asking to learn how to listen. The irony didn't sting. It just felt balanced. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the sun rest on my face. Somewhere behind the glass walls of my new office, the women from the workshop were laughing as they packed up their things. The sound drifted through the open door, soft and real. And I thought maybe this is what light feels like, not something you chase, but something that finally stays. The morning light slipped through the blinds like a quiet visitor. The apartment was still, the air heavy with that kind of calm that only comes after too much noise. I sat at the kitchen table, the glow of my laptop, the only light in the room. The email notification blinked in the corner of the screen. Elaine Hayes. My heart hesitated before my hand did. I clicked. "We're sorry, Clara. We didn't know you were hurting this much." That was it. No explanations, no mention of Emily, no promises to change. Just a single sentence trying to bridge years of distance. I stared at it long enough for the words to start losing meaning. Sorry. Hurting. We. I wondered if she had written it after a long night, or between morning errands. I wondered if she'd shown it to Dad before sending it, or if she'd typed it quickly, hoping it would be enough. My eyes stung, but no tears came. I didn't need them anymore. Some apologies come too late, but I don't need them to forgive. I hovered over the reply button for a few seconds, then closed the window instead. A single click, and the message vanished from my inbox. The city outside was already waking up, the distant sound of traffic, a neighbor's dog barking, the low hum of life continuing. I stood, stretched, and walked to the balcony. The air was cool for Los Angeles in April, soft and salted from the ocean breeze that always found its way inland. Somewhere across the Pacific, Maui was bathed in gold. The place where all of this had begun. I booked the flight without thinking too much about it. Some places call you back, not for closure, but for confirmation that you've truly left. When I arrived, the air smelled the same as it had that first night. The mix of rain and hibiscus, the faint sweetness that clung to everything. The same resort, the same coastline, but the feeling was different now, lighter. I woke early the next morning, slipped on the same golden dress that had once felt like armor, and stepped out onto the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the tide low, the sun stretching across the horizon, like something patient and kind. Nolan was already there, camera in hand, his silhouette outlined by the rising light. He waved when he saw me, but didn't say anything. We didn't need words for this. The ocean roared softly, a sound that felt almost like breathing. I walked toward the water, the hem of my dress brushing against the waves. My reflection rippled in the surf. Brighter now, steadier. Behind me, I could hear the faint click of Nolan's camera. He called out gently, "Just be yourself, Clara. Don't pose, just be." I laughed under my breath. "You know that's harder than it sounds." Maybe he said, "But it looks effortless on you." I turned my face toward the horizon. The light caught on the water, scattering into 1,000 shards. The wind lifted my hair, tangled it, carried it away. For a moment, I felt completely weightless. They said it was just a wedding, just a misunderstanding, just family. But it wasn't just anything. It was the moment everything broke, so that I could finally breathe. I thought about my mother's email, my father's words to the press, Emily's silence. I thought about all the years I tried to make myself smaller, easier to love, quieter, to keep the peace. And then I thought about this. The sea, the wind, the sound of my own voice in my head finally saying enough. Nolan lowered the camera. "You want to see it?" I nodded, stepping closer. On the screen, the frame opened wide, me standing alone on the beach, the dress glowing against the sunlight, the ocean stretching endlessly behind. He smiled. "It's not about revenge," he said. "It's about release." I looked at the photo, then at him. "It's both," I said softly, "but I think I've finally learned the difference." He nodded. "Then we're done." We walked along the shore until the light turned from gold to white waves, chasing our footprints before they could fade on their own. Later that evening, back in my hotel room, I uploaded the final video. No music this time, no edit, just one steady shot, the beach, the light, the quiet. My voice played softly over the sound of the waves. "They said it's just a wedding," I began, but for me, it was the day everything fell apart, and the day I became free. I hit publish and watched the screen for a moment as the upload bar moved across. No nerves, no second-guessing, just stillness. Outside, the last colors of sunset painted the horizon. The ocean looked endless again. I closed the laptop, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window. My reflection in the glass was faint, almost transparent, but this time it didn't bother me. Some parts of us are meant to be quiet. Others are meant to echo. They said it was just a wedding, but it was my awakening. The screen faded to black, and in the soft space that followed, I imagined the voices of the women who had once written to me. Still talking, still sharing, still louder than before. And for the first time, I let the silence stay. If this story found you, if you've ever been told you were too sensitive, too dramatic, too much, maybe it's time to tell your story too. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is simply living free. Stay here for more stories of strength, truth, and awakening.